This video is the last part of a three-part series about the conflict in Sri Lanka between the Sri Lankan state and the Tamil people. It comprises two sections.
Welcome to the final part of our three-part presentation, where we delve into the Sri Lankan state's plans to defeat the Tamil rebellion and enforce a controversial victor's peace. Part 3, Section 1. In Part 2, we witnessed how the Sri Lankan government's military operations were bolstered by support from New Delhi and Beijing. In 2019, Bhashana Abeyewardene, a Sri Lankan journalist and coordinator of Journalists for Democracy in Sri Lanka, pointed out that it was not China but the US that destroyed the parity of status between the warring parties and created the conditions for the Sri Lankan state to resume the war. As we noted in Part 2 of this presentation, defeating the LTTE was part of the US strategy during its involvement in the peace process. It wanted Ranil Wickremesinghe installed as president in 2005. In 2009, these actions helped the Rajapaksa regime quash the Tamil uprising. Colombo was thus assisted by regional and global powers. As Sri Lanka's military decided to confront the LTTE, it realized that external support alone was insufficient. The LTTE was a politico-military organization with grassroots support. In 1997, Dr. Sathananthan, a political scientist with a PhD from Cambridge, pointed out that the LTTE's centrality lies in its nature and history. He highlighted that the LTTE is deeply ingrained in Tamil society, with its guerrillas being the sons, daughters, brothers, and sisters of Tamils. Over the past 2.5 decades, nearly every extended Tamil family in the Northeast has had some form of direct or indirect connection with the LTTE. This meant that the LTTE, which had now emerged as a conventional force, could always resort to guerrilla war by melting into the population. The government was also well aware that a considerable segment of the population supported Tamil independence. To ensure that the call for independence wouldn't endure even after the military defeat of the LTTE, it needed to permanently silence these voices. The Sri Lankan government realized that the goal of crushing the Tamil uprising required a level of violence that could only be described as genocidal. In order to succeed, they had to decimate the LTTE's extensive support base, which encompassed a significant portion of the civilian population. The government, therefore, decided to target civilians, in order to dismantle the LTTE's politico-military structure that was deeply embedded within Tamil people. Balancing this aggressive strategy with the need to avoid global scrutiny proved challenging. This is because Colombo understood that international awareness of its tactics could jeopardize its efforts. In the next section, we will see how the Sri Lankan government implemented its gruesome plan. In the previous section, we revealed the cruel logic behind the Sri Lankan state's decision to wage a war of genocide against the Tamil people. Now, let us delve into the actions pursued, the impact of this decision, and how it played out. The Sri Lankan government was determined to eliminate any witnesses to their atrocities. To achieve this, they ordered all international agencies to leave the conflict zone. The United Nations was the last to depart, reluctantly complying with the government's warning, fearing for the safety of their staff. Frightened civilians, aware of the impending danger, desperately tried to prevent the UN from leaving as their presence offered some measure of protection. Meanwhile, the government restricted access to the theater of war for independent media, favoring its own daily news and the Island publications, known for its support of the military approach. Instead, the Sri Lankan media was forced to serve the state's propaganda. Journalists who refused to toe the government line were silenced. Some disappeared mysteriously, while others were forced to flee the country to escape persecution. In 2009, Reporters Without Borders ranked Sri Lanka 165th out of 173 countries in terms of freedom of press. Dharmaratnam Shiva Ram, a renowned Tamil journalist, was among those murdered by the Sri Lankan state. He met a tragic end, was abducted, and killed in a high-security zone near the parliament. With no international agencies or independent media to report on their actions, the Sri Lankan government launched merciless and brutal bombardments on civilian centers as the army advanced. The Chinese government played a significant role in providing military supplies and diplomatic cover to President Mahinda Rajapaksa, enabling him to ignore international pressure. The Indian government pretty much did the same. As the war progressed, civilians were deceived into seeking refuge in so-called safety zones, only to be deliberately bombed by the Sri Lankan forces. Despite the government's efforts to control information, news of the atrocities began to surface through the internet and social media. In December 2008, the Genocide Prevention Project identified Sri Lanka as one of the 8 red alert countries where genocide and mass atrocities were occurring or at risk of breaking out. In February 2009, Bruce Fein, a former U.S. Deputy Attorney General, drew a comparison between the ongoing massacres in Sri Lanka and the Bosnian Srebrenica genocide in an article published in the Boston Globe. He emphasized the indiscriminate bombing that specifically targeted Tamil civilians during the conflict. On 17 May 2009, the war ended as several of the LTTE's military leaders, including its leader Vila Pillai Pirapaharan, perished on the battlefield. According to the Sydney Morning Herald, an Australian newspaper of 14 May 2011, on the same day, Nadesan and Puladevan, 2 senior political leaders of the LTTE, who were carrying a white flag to surrender, were gunned down. This incident occurred in response to a text from Palitha Kahona, who was not only Sri Lanka's foreign secretary and the public face of the country's war against the LTTE but also a dual Sri Lankan-Australian citizen. The paper reported this in a full-page article titled, "Australian Entangled in a Final Act of Civil War." Hundreds of the LTTE soldiers who had surrendered to the Sri Lankan army were summarily executed on the battlefield, and several thousands of others taken into custody were never to be heard again. In 2011, the panel of experts set up to advise Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon on accountability issues with respect to the final stages of the conflict in Sri Lanka and found credible reports of war crimes committed during the war. The UN estimated that at least 40,000 people were killed. Father Rayapu, a Catholic bishop, estimated the civilian killed during the final days of the war to be around 145,000. The UN's internal investigation, conducted in late 2012, brought to light a sobering truth. The civilian deaths at the hands of the Sri Lankan state could have been prevented had the UN remained in the war zone. Instead, the organization succumbed to pressure, betraying its principles and responsibilities. The investigation's conclusion pointed to a grave failure of the UN to adequately respond to early warnings and the evolving situation during the conflict's final stages and its aftermath. This failure had severe consequences for hundreds of thousands of civilians, contradicting the very principles and responsibilities the UN was meant to uphold. Although the war had ended, the government continued to hunt down those who were former members of the LTTE or were suspected to have had links to the movement. Fearing death, thousands of Tamils fled seeking asylum in foreign countries. The government further maintained a substantial military presence in the Tamil homeland, drawing the attention of the International Crisis Group, a prominent think tank. Their observation in 2014, 5 years after the war's end, revealed an alarming 1-to-5 ratio of military personnel to civilians in the region. This raised concerns about the impact on civilian life and the need for demilitarization efforts. Also, despite the unwavering protest primarily led by Tamil women, demanding accountability from the government for the thousands of missing individuals, the government has callously and defiantly ignored their pleas. By 12 August 2022, this protest had endured for over 2,000 days since its inception. It continues relentlessly, questioning the Sri Lanka state's blatant disregard for the plight of the disappeared and its determination to impose a coercive peace. Meanwhile, no attempt has been made to address the situation that gave rise to a long and bloody conflict since it was brutally put down in 2009. Instead, the Sri Lankan state has erected multiple victory monuments in Tamil areas, like this example in Puthukudi to remind the Tamil people of their subjugation. The evidence before us leaves no room for doubt. The Sri Lankan state's pursuit of a victor's peace is glaringly evident. However, this approach is not only unjust and coercive but also fundamentally unstable. The government's actions, such as dismissing concerns of disappearances, erecting victory monuments in Tamil areas, maintaining a heavy military presence in the Tamil areas, and refusing to address the fundamental causes that led to a bloody conflict, make this abundantly clear.